important. That means the court is likely to have a decision in this case on whether Trump can be prosecuted for the actions around January 6th. They will have a decision by the end of June, which means there would still be time. If the Justice Department decides to proceed, there would still be time for a trial before the election.
That is a key point. We're actually looking at the remarks from the Supreme Court there about this particular case. Jen, explain how this sets the stage for a landmark ruling on presidential power.
Another landmark ruling on presidential power. This would be the third case the court is taking up this term that will affect Donald Trump in some way or another. This one, obviously, remember, they still have the Colorado case. Can he be disqualified from the ballots by any state that said he was an insurrectionist? We're waiting on that decision. This case will determine whether or not he can be prosecuted by special counsel Jack Smith, whether or not under core principles of separation of powers and executive power, whether or not he can be prosecuted or if he's absolutely immune for his acts as president. Those are issues the Supreme Court has never considered because no president has ever been criminally prosecuted for crimes they may have committed while in office. But I think the Supreme Court really had no choice but to take this up under Supreme Court rules when they're trying to decide whether they're going to grant a case. One of the rules is if it's a hugely important issue of constitutional law and it's never been decided, the court needs to grant cert to decide it. I don't think this means the court's necessarily going to reverse the lower court. I think that would be surprising, but they believe that they have an obligation to decide this important issue of law, and they're going to do it relatively quickly, not as fast as Jack Smith wanted. He wanted arguments in March, so they're saying toward the end of April, but still enough time to have a decision this term.
Just fascinating what we're looking at. I want to bring in Jessica Levinson. She's a CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor. I know your work focuses on constitutional law and the Supreme Court. So, Jessica, let's say the court hears this in April, as they have said, and they decide that President Trump is not immune. What happens then?
Exactly what Jan says. Then this trial can continue. Exactly as she said, this is the type of case that I'm going to teach. In fact, I just made room for it in my syllabus. And that's because this is the type of case that the Supreme Court does look at. It's a big constitutional question. It's a matter of first impression because we've never been here before. We've never had a president who was criminally charged. And they're asking a fairly straightforward question. Does a president enjoy absolute immunity from criminal prosecution based on official acts? I expect that they will uphold what the D.C. Circuit said. That was a detailed 57-page opinion. They really went through all of the former president's arguments, specifically the argument that trying him would violate the separation of powers, and the argument that you would first have to be impeached by the House and then convicted in the Senate. They explained why, in their view, those arguments hold no water, why there's no constitutional basis. I expect that the Supreme Court will come to the same conclusion, but exactly as Jan says, this is the type of case that screams out for Supreme Court resolution.
It's an excellent point, Jessica. Just to button that up, Jan, but does that mean there will be a trial in an election year of Donald Trump, who looks like he will be the Republican nominee?
I think that's going to be up to the Justice Department. I mean, I think the court could have an opinion by the end of June, early July. Then that would pave the way for the trial judge here to set another trial date. But remember, the Republican National Convention is in the middle of July. And so I think that's a question for the Justice Department. Are they really going to try who appears to be the Republican nominee that close to the election when they waited 30 months to file charges in this case?
Let's bring in Robert Costa, our chief election correspondent. And Robert, just the stakes of this amidst the Republican convention in the middle of the summer before this extremely important presidential election, this rematch largely probably between Trump and Biden.
Nora, former President Donald Trump's legal storms are quickly evolving into a legal hurricane that's also a political one. While it is to be determined, as Jan said, whether Trump will face a federal trial on the January 6th case or the classified records case later this year before the election, it's already certain that he will face a criminal trial starting in New York and Lower Manhattan starting on March 25th. And that will go into April. It's about a 6-week trial. So while the Supreme Court hears questions about presidential immunity in April and maybe into May, Trump's already going to be forced by law to be sitting in a courtroom facing scrutiny over those hush money payments made to a porn star, Stormy Daniels, in 2016. And you add to this all the Republican uncertainty out there about having a potential nominee who's sitting in federal court, city court, state court, maybe down in Georgia, ahead of an election that's already in a very divided country and closely contested.
I know you're going to be talking more about this on the CBS Evening News. We almost need a chart for all of these trials that are happening. Let's bring in congressional correspondent Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill. And Scott, you have followed the January 6th defendants and the prosecutions of them probably closer than anybody. If you follow your Twitter feed, you've been clear on this. What do you make of this particular decision ruling? It's not official, or what the Supreme Court says they're going to do by granting cert.
Time is running short to get a trial back on the calendar, Nora. This trial of Donald Trump for election subversion was supposed to begin Monday. April 22nd was the approximate window for jury deliberations. If the Supreme Court returns this to the district court judge, Tanya Chutkan here in Washington, she has some real estate left on her calendar. We've been monitoring her calendar and her work. There are spaces in May and June, but this trial requires a lot of real estate, likely to go 6 to 8 weeks. It will consume everything in its path. It may be very difficult logistically to get this reimplanted on Judge Chutkan's calendar. I see some detention hearings and sentencing hearings she has this spring. It'll take some movement, and that's if the Supreme Court promptly returns it to her.
And is it likely, if that trial happens, that former President Trump would be in the courtroom every day?
And it absolutely would have to be here in Washington, D.C. every day at the defense table, which, oh, by the way, is going to require quite a security perimeter and footprint, and also would move the 2024 campaign for 6 to 8 weeks to just off Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and the cameras that are always here.
Just extraordinary. I mean, we should actually we could look at not only the time he's going to spend in New York, the potential time that he could spend in D.C. for this particular case, how many weeks of the presidential campaign he would actually be in a courtroom facing multiple different charges that await him. All right. Thank you both. And just to recap, the Supreme Court just agreeing to hear Trump's immunity case on the federal election interference charges. Those oral arguments are scheduled for the week of April 22nd. Our coverage will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and then we're going to have a full recap again tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Thanks for staying with us. We are following breaking news out of the Supreme Court. The justices have agreed to decide whether former President Trump is entitled to immunity from federal prosecution in the 2020 election case. I want to bring in Major Garrett, who, of course, is our chief Washington correspondent. Major, good to see you. I know we've been waiting for this decision. Your takeaways on the Supreme Court deciding that they will hear Trump's immunity plea?
It is an important constitutional matter, one the court has never had to consider because no former president has ever been prosecuted or, in the terms of that prosecution, asserted to this highest court in the land that every activity undertaken during a presidency is absolutely immune from any second guessing or criminal prosecution federally. These are issues we've never had to grapple with. And the simple reason we're having to grapple with these is because the former president, while president of the United States, wouldn't accept the results of the 2020 election, lied about them relentlessly, and undertook an effort, which is now subject to federal prosecution, to overturn that election. We are here because of the actions and decisions undertaken about the 2020 election by the former president. We're not here for any other reason than that. And it is an important constitutional question, but it's being asked in a way that is in the backdrop of January 6th, an assault on the U.S. Capitol to delay the peaceful transfer of power because on that day we were to certify the electoral vote sent in legally and in a binding way by every state in the union. That, yes, all of this is extraordinary, but we cannot overlook why it is extraordinary. The singular act of a president to not accept the results of a legal, verified election and to deny his likely successor, his certified successor, his place in the American presidency through a peaceful transfer of power. That is why we are here. So yes, it's an important constitutional question, the Supreme Court had a big choice. Does the Supreme Court take the rulings of a district court and an appellate court as the final word? I think it understood the popular perception of the Supreme Court is wavering, to put it gently. And because 3 of the justices sitting on this court were appointed under the Trump presidency, this court wanted to make sure this decision was reflective of the court that in some ways Trump created. So if it's negative against the former president, it's emphatic by his own hand-picked justices. No, you don't enjoy this absolute immunity, and you're going to have to go to trial. But the timing is astonishing. If there's a trial, Caitlin, as was just discussed in the special report, it will collide with the Republican National Convention in Michigan. It may bleed over to the Democratic National Convention in August in Chicago. And as we are living through this history, we are going to have to ask ourselves relentlessly, why did the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, wait so long to set in motion or to give the signal that a prosecution of this former president over January 6th and everything related to the 2020 election waited so long? Why? This collision is in part because of signals sent by the Justice Department. And it is colliding with the presidential election in a way that will test this country, its laws, its institutions, and its politics as never tested before.
Yeah, I know we throw around the word unprecedented, but this is very true in this case, of course, and the way in which this has become a courtroom campaign for... It
is, I think a better terminology is breathtaking. It will take the breath away of this country.
On the timeline, I want to bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree, who joins us now. Tom, I thank you for being here. I want to get your thoughts on what Major just mentioned here, was just talking about here, the way in which the decision by Merrick Garland to take his time here in making a decision. What kind of impact has that had?
It has had a massive impact, and it will continue to have a massive impact as this whole saga plays out over the course of the summer. It's always been a little peculiar as to why the Justice Department and Merrick Garland waited so long to spur this prosecution on, to bring the charges, and to begin with this, because they knew that delays happen in criminal trials for one reason or another, particularly in a case of this magnitude. It was virtually certain that former President Trump would make an immunity defense, that immunity defense would then get litigated up through the courts of appeals, possibly to the Supreme Court. All the while, the trial court proceedings were put on hold. So they knew this was a possibility. And the fact that they didn't bring these charges until, a year or so, plus or minus, before the election, meant that they were acting on a very tight timetable with virtually no margin for error. And now we're seeing as it's playing out, I think everything's going to be put in a very difficult position. Once the Supreme Court decides, it's going to be May or June at the earliest. And then the Justice Department will face the question as to whether they do want to push for a trial date before the election, during the convention and during all the political windup.
And Tom, there is a set of guidelines within the Justice Department about decisions, both to prosecute, meaning to bring charges, or to press ahead as it relates to an election calendar. What are those guidelines, and how do you think they will manifest in this enormously public and consequential decision once the Supreme Court does issue a ruling?
Sure, the guidelines are a little bit hazy. The basic rule is that the Justice Department never wants to take action, and that would include bringing people to trial, filing charges close to an election in a way that potentially could influence the election. But it's not as though there's a specific calendar date in the Justice Department manual that says thou shalt not charge after such and such a date. It's a question of judgment. But here, it seems almost impossible to think that they could try to fit in a trial before you get into the full-on political season. As I said a minute ago, the Supreme Court is not going to decide this case until May at the earliest, and quite possibly not until June. There will then need to be at least a month or 2 or maybe 3 months of preparations in the trial court before you can begin the trial. You have to have pre-trial motions. You have to select a jury. There are all sorts of things that go into getting a case ready for trial. So by the time you're looking at the actual trial beginning, you're kind of talking early fall, which is, again, right in the heart of the political seasons. I think this would be a very difficult decision for the Justice Department to decide whether they still want to proceed with a trial before the election.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, too, because what kind of impact does this have on the underlying case here?
Yeah, well, the underlying case is going to remain apparently in a state of suspended animation until the Supreme Court decides whether former President Trump has immunity. If they decide that, well, he does have immunity, the case disappears. If, however, they decide that he does not have immunity, well, then presumably the engines will immediately restart in the district court. And there you're going to have that 2 to 3 to 4 month run up to a trial where the lawyers are racing around. They're getting their evidence ready. They're getting their witnesses ready. They're getting their trial preparations ready for what probably will be the trial of the century. Can't happen overnight. So you're just looking at a system that already builds in that several month process and pushes us right up until the cusp of the election.
Tom, could you evaluate for the audience the merits of the former president's assertion made by his attorneys to the court that absolute immunity is a real thing and should be basically accepted by the Supreme Court as an orientation toward not only power, but separation of powers?
It's a very, very aggressive argument. Certainly no court has ever accepted this argument before, this broad scope of immunity that former President Trump is claiming. I think that the government has a very good counter argument that recognizing immunity of this nature would threaten the separation of powers, that it would threaten our constitutional structure, and that it would elevate the president above the law. And the hypothetical you all remember from the appeals court argument where they said, well, if former President Trump is right, that presidents are absolutely immune, could a president order SEAL Team 6 to kill his opponent? Clearly, the answer to that is no. But that's a very difficult aspect for the former president in making this argument and trying to persuade the Supreme Court to go where it's never gone before and broaden and expand the scope of presidential immunity to encompass anything that the president does while he's serving in office.
And Major, I want to ask you a political question, which is, given what Tom said about what this does to the underlying case, I mean, the strategy from the Trump team has been to try to delay this as much as possible, right? Yeah. I mean, this is part of a bigger play here.
I mean, I'll leave it to Tom on the legal side of it, but just the jousting and the politics of the jousting in which the former president almost always finds himself on the better end of the spectrum, this is a victory. Any delay is a victory. Any delay, even by a day or two, is a victory. And this is not a day or two. Right. As we've laid out, this is several months. And the complications of having all of the former president's due process rights protected, as Tom laid out, they inevitably must be protected. In a high-profile case like this, all due process rights must be protected, but especially if the litigant is a former president of the United States, every benefit of the doubt is going to go to that particular high-profile defendant. The Trump team has known that from a legal strategic point of view. Every delay adjures to his benefit, not just legally, but politically. And now this case, if it follows the timeline that we have laid out, it seems almost impossible to carry out in the heat, the white-hot heat of a 2024 presidential campaign.
Exactly. Major Garrett, stick with us. And Tom Dupree, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate your analysis here. I do want to bring in CBS News campaign reporter Katrina Kaufman joining us now. She's also an attorney. I know, Katrina, you have been covering all of the Trump cases here. So can you kind of put this into context for our viewers here who are often faced with the challenge of trying to keep track of everything going on the legal front for Donald Trump? We were just talking with Major and Tom about kind of the timeline here and how this collides with other cases that Trump may be facing and, of course, with the underlying January 6th case. But what other cases are kind of on the horizon, and does this interfere with any of those?
Hi, Caitlin. So, yes, we have coming up the first criminal trial that's going to be prosecuted against Trump, which is the hush money case here in New York. That's going to be March 25th. And originally, this D.C. trial was supposed to be in early March. It was scheduled for March 4th. But what's happened with this immunity issue has just pushed that, as we see. And now, by my calculations, I think that case probably couldn't start until September if the Supreme Court allows it to go ahead. And that could actually put it in conflict with the Georgia case, because Fani Willis was looking to have that start on August 5th. So that would potentially put these two trials in conflict. There's a lot of stuff going on with Fulton County as well to see how that case is going to proceed. But that's what comes to mind first when I think about the intersection of these cases at this moment.
And Katrina, I know we're kind of every day on watch for some kind of decision here, but I'm curious, too, about your general takeaways from the Supreme Court deciding to take up this case.
I was a bit surprised. I think the fact that it took them so long to make a decision about this, I was under the impression that perhaps they were going to deny it. Someone was writing an opinion, but it looks like the Supreme Court wants to weigh in on this, and it makes a lot of sense. This is an issue of first impression. It's a major constitutional issue, and the Supreme Court really should consider it.
Katrina, thank you very much. Major, I do want to talk. Oh, can I? Okay, thank you. We're rolling here. I do want to talk just a little bit again about the politics here, because we've both been on the campaign trail a lot over the past several months.
Right.
And when you go to rallies for the former president, when you talk to voters, this is very much on their minds in terms of them lumping together all of those cases that Katrina just described and trying to cast everything as political. And to your point about the strategy involved on the legal front being a political strategy too, the way in which this has not only endeared his supporters to him, but has, you know, kind of, the more information comes out, the more they feel impassioned for him.
And let's just focus on the January 6th case, this particular case, because this is what the Supreme Court is being asked to decide. Only in the context of this case. This is not a decision that has any bearing on the documents case or any other, only on January 6th. And you know this and I know this, but I want to share it with our audience because it's very important to understand the underlying politics and Trump's relationship to his supporters. They look at this and say the following. The Justice Department didn't do anything. Then the January 6th Select Committee, which many Trump supporters regard as a partisan maneuver. Two Republicans who were anti-Trump on that committee working with Democrats did this investigation, which they regard as kind of an elaborate TV program meant to get the former president. I'm not validating any of this, but this is how they view it. And then the January 6th committee makes its recommendations, and then and only then, according to Trump supporters, does the Justice Department kick in gear. So the way they digest that is Nancy Pelosi created a committee filled with hard Democrats and two anti-Trump Republicans, produced evidence and a report, and then and only then, so it's basically Nancy Pelosi kicking this over to the democratically led Justice Department under Joe Biden, who brings these charges, and that's why we're here. Skipping over entirely what Trump did and lies about the 2020 election. This is why for this case, which is a super important case, not just this defendant, the former president, but the American presidency, Trump supporters just see it as another partisan maneuver. And that story, that narrative for themselves doesn't budge. You've heard it. I've heard it. And you have all these other intervening factors, the Supreme Court and legal appeals, and all, they've already decided this. And so now they look, hey, this trial could be right up again, or maybe not even held at all. See, our guy wins again, no matter what. They can't get him. No matter what they do, they can't get him because he's smart enough, tactical enough, he can maneuver around it, and we're going to have the election on our terms. That's how, I guarantee you, that's how this is being interpreted moment by moment this afternoon across the country and among those who are Trump-supporting Republicans. A lot of other Americans will look at this and say, wow, Supreme Court could have read that 57-page appeals court ruling and said, you know what, they got it right. The law, every underlying case, all precedent, all history, done. Mr. Former President, you don't have it. And they could have made that determination several weeks ago. But no, the weeks and weeks and go on. Now they say, no, we're going to weigh in. And they have to know. They are not immune from the larger political conversation in this country. Supreme Court knows by waiting this long and now pushing into April, they've made this trial, however it decides, almost untriable in this calendar year. Not impossible, but very difficult. And even if it is held, it will reinforce all of these underlying things we've talked about, suspicions, aggressions, grievances, the Trump supporters and the Trump legal team and the former president himself not only has, but will continue to have about this particular case.
And a lot of those sentiments have been fostered by Republican rivals who have not criticized Trump on this at all and kind of helped to create that scenario as well.
And look, there are plenty of fair-minded Republicans who say, you know, maybe this particular question about what the former president did in office and January 6th is best handled by the next election in a political context only. Don't prosecute him over it. Let's see that he's defeated for a bid for re-election, and that would end it. That is an interpretation that even some Republicans who are not adoring of the former president hold. But that ship has sailed. This is a prosecuted case. He's indicted. The Supreme Court will decide whether or not he or any future occupant of this office has absolute immunity or not. But even if it decides you don't, and you've got to go to trial, the practical schedule of that trial now is enmeshed with the presidential campaign, and therefore may not go ahead.
Collision course indeed. Major Garrett, as always, thank you very much for sticking with us. And we will be following all of this news coming up. But we also have some other news. Former President Donald Trump and President Biden are both going to be in Texas tomorrow. What to expect from those visits? That's next.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's
keep
wrong
going?
with that argument?
What have you
Do
learned?
you know why?
Why?
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish
That
you and
we
I are going to
just-
have.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Is it good? Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
If we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
Hunger, yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. It's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
How can we become our best selves? That may be more about character than talent.
The ultimate mark of your potential is how far you've climbed, not how high you've gone.
Realizing your true potential with Adam Grant as we go person to person.
Welcome back to America Decides. As we've been reporting, the Supreme Court has decided it will hear the case involving former President Trump's request for immunity in the 2020 election case. We are also reacting to politics of the day out of Michigan for the former president and the current president. President Biden easily won last night's primary, but faced outspoken opposition from some in his own party. More than 100,000 Democrats in the state voted for uncommitted to rebuke the president over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. And tomorrow, both Biden and Trump will be at the southern border. The president will head to Brownsville, Texas, and Trump will deliver remarks in Eagle Pass. So for more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Bo Erickson, who is joining us from Brownsville, Texas. Bo, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here.